Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today my guest is Kyla Scanlon. And Kyla is, well, we're going to ask her to introduce herself, as we always do on the show. So over to you, Kyla. Who are you? What do you do? And what do you care about?
No, thank you for having me on the show. So I am Kyla, and I do financial content, particularly in the education space. So I'm across social media. So I do videos about the Federal Reserve, about inflation, about the labor market, across TikTok, across Instagram, across YouTube. I have a newsletter, kyla.substack.com, and my first book is coming out on May 28th. So it's really just a focus on financial education. That's what I do and who I am.
Excellent. So usually I would have tried to read your book before we had this conversation, but your book's not actually available even to purchase in my side of the world. I can't even pre-purchase it, which is interesting. But
Oh,
we have interesting copyright laws here in South Africa. We might be a
oh,
developing nation, but we have first world, first adopters on really any sorts of legislation that's out there. We'll try it. We'll do it. We were up for buying whatever red tape someone has invented. But anyway, I thought we could have a conversation around the sorts of popular economics that you do, because you talk about real economics, macroeconomics, monetary economics, but at the same time, your video content that you put out, your like little TikTok shorts or Instagram shorts, for those of us who are old enough and don't really go to TikTok much, or YouTube, if you're even older than that, talk about like popular economics, and that you talk about things that are relevant to everybody, to day-to-day people, like what's going on in the news. And I really love that, because I think economists, and I am one at least by training, even if not in practice, get a really bad rap in the world, right? So, I mean, people are always saying, "Oh, the problem with the world is economists and politicians," not understanding, of course, there's a great deal of difference between those of us who observe the choices that people are making, whether they're making good choices or not, and those of us who try and prescribe what we should be doing. And I think that's where a lot of the sort of misconceptions around economics comes from, this idea that all economists are sort of libertarian capitalists, and that we're responsible for the way the economy works, not just really reporters and observers of human behavior, which is, of course, how the field started with good old Adam Smith. So if you have any sort of opening comments in that regard as to your personal approach to the world that is economics.
I think what I try to do is make all of that information really accessible for people. And so in the US, we have an election coming up. There's a lot of concern about what that could mean. And when I started all of this about 3 years ago, it was during the GameStop era. So GameStop going crazy, inflation was sky high. The Federal Reserve was like, what do we do? And so all of these things were happening all around us. And I didn't feel like there was a lot of really accessible explanations. Like, the one amazing thing about economists and researchers is that they're incredibly smart, but sometimes translating that can be a little bit difficult for the average person. Like, these research papers are dense. And so I have a background in economics and in finance. And so I just started making videos to help break all of that down for the everyday person. In the way that I approach the content that I produce is not that people need to know like exactly how to calculate CPI. Like, they don't need to know owner's equivalent rent, specifically CPI being the inflation measurement in the US. But they do need to know what CPI is doing and like where it could go. And so that's kind of how I think about stuff, is to provide a toolbox for people. That's what the book is about. I'm sorry that you can't get access to it. The publishing industry is like so outside of my realm of knowledge. So sorry about that. But so toolbox for people, that's what the book is meant to do. And that's how I think about all my work.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the book. How did you get persuaded to do such a thing? I know I've put some of these things together myself. They're not exactly great economic investments. Maybe for you, maybe you're much more popular than we are. I don't know, you have a bigger market to sell into, but people write books for all sorts of reasons. And what was the reason that you decided to write yours?
Yeah, that's funny that you said what convinced you. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I'm so grateful to have written it. It was such an incredible experience, a lot of learning techniques built into it. But I wrote the book because I do all these videos, like primarily around the news. And I get a lot of questions about, like, well, what is inflation? Like, what is GDP? And so I wrote this book to be kind of like a foundational guide to the economy. There's a lot of really good foundational guides out there, like Basic Economics, Economics in One Lesson. Jeremy Rudd just wrote a great Intro to Economics sort of book. But my book has 60 illustrations and is written in very accessible language. It's really just meant for people to kind of enjoy economics. And the way that I've always thought about the book and what I wanted to put into it when I first learned that I'd be writing it was I really think economics needs a little bit more art. Like it really needs a little bit more beauty. And so that was also sort of the side goal with the book, is to create this toolbox, this foundational guide to the economy, but also show people that economics can be fun and like doesn't have to be super dry and boring and like a bunch of men standing around in suits. Like it can be something that everyone can understand if they're given the tools to do so.
Okay, so what more can people expect from getting the book? I can break that into two questions. Who did you write it for? Who do you want to read this thing? And then secondly, kind of what are they going to get out of it? What is the one thing you want people to have or to understand once they've put it down and hopefully finished it?
Yeah. There's some crazy stat about people only finishing like, I think it's like 20% of books that they start, something like, which I fall into that camp too. But yeah, I mean, I think that who it's written for is anybody who wants to understand the economy. It's kind of geared toward a younger audience just because that's usually who I make content for. And the language is written in a way that might appeal more to a younger audience than an older demographic, but it's really for everybody. And I know that's kind of a lazy way to describe the book, but it's for anyone who wants to understand the economy. And then the main takeaway that I would want people to have from the book is that they can understand the economy. A big theme in the book and a big theme throughout all of my work is that people are the economy. And I think oftentimes in the US specifically, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of confusion about what's actually happening in the world. Like we're in this huge post-truth society. And so I'm hoping that like it'll be a more quantitative analysis for people to pull from rather than maybe pulling from media sources that don't have their best interest in mind about what's going on. Like it's really about, we're facing this crisis where it's like people either need to kind of figure out how they interpret information or we need better information interpreters. And I think this is a tool for people to interpret their information as they get it.
When you speak about that, like this distilling truth in a world of distruth, in a world of personal facts, if you're kind of more right-wing orientated, or personal lived experience, if you're more left-wing orientated, some of the things that you talk about, that you've spoken about certainly a lot, and I think you're probably responsible for coining the term the vibe session, right? You speak about that, but at the same time, there's also a lot of gaslighting that comes from our financial powers that be, our Federal Reserves, our governments, and all the rest of it. I mean, like that's kind of part of the role of shall we say, a national economist anyway, is to kind of gaslight the people, to kind of change expectations in order to nudge behavior, right? But there's kind of a truth in between those two worldviews. So maybe you want to explain what the vibe session concept is, and also how even in spite of that, even when the numbers don't necessarily align with our feelings, that there are still some truths to our feelings that we need to also unpack in a different direction.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The vibe session is this idea of a disconnect between consumer sentiment and economic data. And I did coin the term back in July of 2022. Somebody from JP Morgan is saying that they coined the term, and I'm not sure what to do about that. So I wrote this piece back in July of 2022, and the idea was pulled from my comments. Because like every day I post a video across social media, I get hundreds of comments, and I would be like, oh, GDP is going up, inflation is going down, like it's great out here. And people were like, I feel horrible. And so I was like, this is really quite an interesting discrepancy, an interesting disparity. And I created this term to kind of describe that. And the term has definitely taken a life of its own. But the idea was, again, this disconnect between consumer sentiment and economic data, but it's also meant to highlight that, like, yes, the feelings do matter. To answer the second part of your question, we have a structural affordability crisis. And of course, I'm in the US, so I speak specifically to the US, but there's structural affordability problems all over the world. where like we have a housing crisis, we have student loan debt that's creating a lot of issues. We have interest rates that are very high because the Fed has been raising them in order to battle inflation. And so there are real reasons for why people feel bad. And then if you point to the gaslighting, as you called it, it's true. There is a need, a political posturing that happens with economics. Like economics and politics are very intertwined. You can even look at the tariffs that President Biden is now going to levy against China, $18 billion worth of tariffs. It's not that much, but it's all about the political sense of it, right? It's what it means to put tariffs on China. And it's similar with how the Federal Reserve sets monetary policy. I think it was one of the big banks published this paper talking about how interest rates and the balance sheet don't matter as much as what the Fed chair says. Like people will make trades based on the color of Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, his tie. And so I think that's kind of the hard part about the idea of the vibe session, is that we do have this economic data, but consumer sentiment is formed far outside of just economic data. And I think too that the data that we have doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what we need to know about the economy most of the time. GDP, so gross domestic product, is probably not a great example of an economy. It's telling us how much people are spending and like what the government is spending and what businesses are doing and how much we're exporting and importing, but that doesn't really tell us how happy people are. And similar with the jobs report that we get in the United States, JOLTS, the job openings and labor turnover survey, is the main way that we measure the strength of the labor market, the job openings that businesses are listing, but people are not responding to the survey how they used to. I think the response rate is down to 30%. And so we're gauging the health of the entire labor market. Of course, there's other metrics that go into it, but like this main metric on a 30% response rate of a survey. And I think that's the tough part about economics is like, you have people's feelings, you have actual economic data. The feelings can sometimes be maybe not matching reality, but then the data maybe also isn't representative of reality. And I think that's the situation that we're in right now.
It's a really specific representation of reality. And like as we know, as soon as you start to measure anything and you start to manage salaries or performance or country performance or individual performance based on that number, of course that number is going to be managed and to the point of being manipulated. I mean, that's just the way that people work, right? I mean, as soon as you've got a target, you've got like an arbitrage opportunity to bend those numbers to fit whatever the benchmark is supposed to be. I think that's also why we get a lot of pushback around the world of economics, and the people say these numbers clearly are not representative of reality. They're clearly a flawed mirror. And yet they use to determine things like interest rates, which have a direct impact on my life as a human being. And I don't want to talk to you about interest rates because you spend a lot of time talking about interest rates. I think that's how you actually kind of certainly got onto my radar, sort of like with your actually entertaining commentary on the American Fed, but like generally just the way that monetary policy plays out. And interest rates are an interesting one. It's certainly something that I spend quite a lot of time thinking about. First of all, do you think that they actually do work to control inflation? And secondly, I know that Lynn Alden's just come out with her book not that long ago on bad money, and I think she put it so beautifully that the interest rates, the pain really is not just internalized locally; it's also kind of exported to the rest of the world. So as a South African in a very weak economy, we pay a lot of attention to what your Fed's doing because our government doesn't really have a choice. If you raise your interest rates, we have to raise ours even higher. Otherwise, goodbye capital flows. So I don't know what your thoughts are on those two things. Do they work to control inflation? And what about the external costs? And I love asking Americans about this, particularly since the MMT philosophy was so popular a while ago. And like Stephanie Kelton likes coming out and it's like, this is costless policy, but it's not costless to us over here on the other side of the world.
No, I think MMT has died because of what's happening with inflation.
That's been interesting. We still have a few diehard fans, even in my country, which is incredible.
I mean, it's a great idea if it works. It's a very cool concept, but I have a couple of paragraphs on that in the book, and I'm like, I don't think so. But I mean, interest rates. I think that's a really tough thing that the Fed is going to have to figure out soon. There's a lot of data pointing to most of the inflation that we have seen go away was really just because supply chains were normalizing. It wasn't because interest rates. And I think that honestly, the hard lesson of this last rate hike cycle was that interest rates aren't working in the way that we would hope that they would. They're making mortgage rates really high, but that's kind of
Which is
like
a
the
primary
only.
driver of inflation,
I
ironically.
know. And yeah, and like shelter costs are like 70% of inflation. And so you have these really high mortgage rates, and then you have home prices that are just through the roof. And so the solution would be to build more homes to address some of that at least. But it's very expensive to build homes because rates are so high. And so it's kind of this really odd situation. Auto insurance is really high as well. That's sort of rate hike driven. As well as driven by bad drivers in the US. And so I think that's the tough thing that everyone's trying to nail down is like, do the monetary policy tools actually work? And we're kind of in this last leg of the inflation fight right now. And inflation is still not where anybody really wants it to be, and actually is printed a little bit hotter than I think people wanted it to this last month. But again, it was driven by shelter costs, it was driven by energy prices, it was driven by auto insurance. And so all of these things are not really things that like rate hikes are going to fix. I think that if the one lesson that we learned from the last inflation cycle was that it was supply side driven, it wasn't really demand side driven. Like, yes, you had people with their stimulus checks going and spending more money, but like really these were supply side problems that require supply side solutions, not making life more expensive for the everyday person. So I think that's the hard part about interest rates is they don't work probably as a monetary policy tool, but they're kind of all we have. And maybe they will work. Like maybe the lag effects will kick in and like we'll see inflation go below 2%. But then what was the second part of your question? The
Oh,
external costs. Yeah.
the costs thereof, the externality. I don't even look at that. So if that's part of your domain, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I try to really pay attention to international impacts of American policy. I feel like that's something that US people are really bad about. We're very, very self-centered, as I'm sure you know. But no, I think it's a really big deal. This is outside of the conversation of interest rates, but Ethiopia is banning ICE cars. So they're switching entirely to EVs because they don't want to be beholden to the fossil fuel cycle where like, it's like, how are you going to get oil? How are you going to pay for oil? Like, they're like, we're just going to do EVs. Like, let's just leave us alone, everybody. And so I think that's kind of the problem, that's outside of monetary policy, but like the US does export so much of its pain abroad. Like even Europe, with the energy crisis that happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, was like snapping up everybody's energy and making it really difficult for developing nations to get access to natural gas, specifically, I think specifically Pakistan. And so I think that developed nations are very used to just stepping on everybody else. And they definitely do that with monetary policy because as we hike rates, you all have to too. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the US, but they're the central bank of the world. And I think that's a hard lesson to process.
And what are your thoughts on the future of that, though? I know there's various different thought leaders. It's a terrible term. I apologize in advance for anyone that has to listen to that. But there's lots of people that have different views over the US's future as the global central bank, right? And there's various different schools of thought. Some people think that there's like a BRICS takeover in the works, or that there's going to be a bipolar dichotomous world ahead. Other people very adamantly think that there's really nothing that can challenge US dominance going forward. I've certainly got my own thoughts, but I'm quite curious as to yours and where you land on that debate, because I'm endlessly surprised at how different those views are from people that I respect and follow, particularly from your side of the world, from the inside looking out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the US is kind of mistakes is too big of a word for somebody with my like experience in the world. I don't know if it's a mistake, but like the US is friendshoring quite a bit. The US is reshoring, let's say. They're not even friendshoring. I think the US is really entering this period of trade isolationism, which is net harmful for the United States, I think. The US is very big and has oceans on both sides and has a lot of energy resources, but I still think the US needs friends. And I think that, we're beating up on Canada constantly. So I don't think that's very good. And then, I think we're just poking the stick of China, which is not very good either. And then in terms of the BRICS situation, yeah, China is doing something, that's for sure. There's all sorts of rumblings going on, but their economy kind of collapsed. So I think they're still pulling together from that. And then Russia, of course, is making all sorts of moves, trying to set a certain precedent, obviously. So I'm not sure if something will challenge the US. I do think we are very, very polarized within the US and then outside of the world as well. So, I think it's still, this is tough to say, but you can't say that an empire is never going to fall, because it's they always do. And the US is just so fragile. I love it. I love the US and I'm so grateful to be here. But if you look at the political system, we really can't get anything done. And I don't know how you can be a global leader and not be able to run your country effectively. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree that generally in a competitive world, that's if you are big and lazy, you do get left behind. That's the beauty of capitalism, right? But that's sort of and that applies to markets and applies to nations too. I think that is based on the assumption, which doesn't always play out in the real world, that the game is not rigged to a certain extent, right? Capitalism works very well at reducing inequality if it is an actually free market. We don't have free markets, which makes capitalism a very unfair game to play when some people are playing with different rules to what other people are playing with. And that's why we have these massive inequalities between big companies and small ones, between big countries and small ones. And I think that's to understand money and markets, we need to understand power and violence, which is a very sort of base thing to say. But effectively, if you look at the dollar's power over the world, it's nominally backed by the petrodollar, but underneath that, it's really backed by the credible threats of violence, right? And in order to challenge that, you kind of need a power that's as powerful as that. And I think that's what I'm watching for. I think that being a member of the BRICS alliance, I wouldn't be too worried about BRICS in general. China is quite a different entity, so is India. I think that's to confound our very different group of nations into any sort of collective whole with any sort of collective agenda is a utopian ideal from both inside and outside, people who would like to see a more balanced world going forward. And as much as the US is fragile, as you mentioned, the large powers like China and India, which are the only weighty enough counterbalances, because as I said, the alliances with the BRICS and the actual ideological differences within them could prove to be somewhat challenging. What the US did very well last century was having an alignment of values with its strategic partners across the world. And I think that that's largely what's missing with BRICS. It's an alliance of convenience and money, not an alliance of ideology and values, which makes it more fragile ultimately. And then you kind of have to look at the alternatives. Did China get rich enough before it got old? That's a really interesting question. Can it keep up the momentum? Of course, it's very glamorous and exciting to see the very big buildings when you go there. No doubt they've been very successful. But what does the future look like when you look at the demography, when you look at cash flows going forward, when you look at incomes rising and that comparative advantage then shifting to more developing kind of nations? That is the question. Did China get rich enough before it got old? That's something we'll have to see play out. And then there's India. I know a lot of Americans are really, really bullish on India, but I think that India has a lot of similarities with Africa. And once you kind of lived in that environment, in fact, we have a large amount of India within us in South Africa. So we kind of have a first-hand kind of assessment of what it is to work in that sort of environment with that sort of an economy. And there's an underlying chaos in India and Africa that I don't think much of the rest of the world has fully understood. In that, individuals act as individual agents, not as collectives aligned either by ideology or through a sort of totalitarian regime long-term plan like China had, which again is, I think, something that makes the whole BRICS alliance quite fragile, because you've got nations that are underpinned by very different forces of momentum. And I don't know if there's an appetite also from a monetary side to take on the costs and the responsibilities the US has took on, as much as the US does run most of the rest of the world like tribute states that we've got to sort of pay our pound of flesh in order to participate in the world. It also performs a service. Like we can complain about paying our taxes, but that's effectively what we do when we pay high interest rates in developed nations. We're paying taxes to effectively a protector state that's there to kind of look after us, right? So whether that contract plays out and how that resentment breaks down, much at the national level and at an international level, we're all happy to pay tribute to the US when the world is a safe and more peaceful place. Or not happy, but we somehow understand that trade, much like we understand that trade with our own governments, like when they provide safety and security and an economy that's like at least provides you the opportunity to get a job. We're more happy to pay our taxes when that breaks down. So I think that the challenge to the US almost comes from within the empire, not without. And that's almost, therefore, the challenge is going to come from a generational level and a system change rather than perhaps a national change. I don't know if I've explained my position very well, but I'm just looking for the credible counterbalance, and we haven't quite found it yet. And I think the same sort of things playing out in like my country with politics. I'm sure you see the same thing with yours, in that young generations, you can kind of equate developing nations with the sort of young generations at a global level, dissatisfied with the status quo, but don't have like a viable alternative for changing it sustainably. And so you see youth voter apathy patterns going on, but you don't see youth anger translating into action. So I kind of almost say that this generation is the eye roll at the machine generation, like the rage is not there yet. So I'm really curious what comes next.
Yeah, no, I think it's a big question, because I do think that's true, that it is more of an eye roll than action. And, I guess the student protests were a movement for sure. But, I think that there's an element of theatrics to it too, where it's like there's not a sense of reality behind it. So I don't know. I think that, to the point of demographics, I think that's like the biggest challenge that the US is going to face. Like, 49% of our seniors don't have retirement savings. Like, we have a fertility rate that's pretty abysmal. It's really expensive to have kids. Childcare costs have gone up like 32% since 2019. And I think that's, definitely part of the infighting issue in the US.
I've also just written an article, and it's something that I do quite a lot of work with young people, because I'm a little bit old now myself. I don't have to give too much away, but certainly I don't count to be part of like the youth league in any major political party anymore. So I feel like I'm allowed to talk about the young people and the old people both, while you kind of in this interim space. You can just judge from the middle rather than from the edges. But there is this kind of sense, like speaking to young people in the recent sort of study we did with under 30-year-olds in South Africa, 30 years on from democracy. And we had like a media launch for the report we did. And I asked one of the young people who we interviewed what his, and he can represent his generation to, their plans were for sort of, taking back power from this older generation that's objectively failed them. And he was like, well, we're planning on waiting for them to die out. And I was like, you're going to be waiting a while. Like, I know our life expectancies here in South Africa aren't quite as large as they are in the US, but they're definitely tending upwards. And I don't know if you've noticed the sort of age in your own politicians. Like, if you're going to wait for the old guard to essentially move on one funeral at a time, like the joke is in academia, you're going to be waiting until you are grandparents yourself. That's if you had any children. Like, you're going to be old men and women before you're going to make any sort of difference. And I don't know if you see the same thing where you are. So there's a huge disrespect and dissatisfaction with everything that's going on in the economy and politics. But there doesn't seem to be an appetite to take on the change. There's an appetite for anarchy, though, which is a different sort of conversation, and nihilism. And we certainly got wonderful case studies here, and I'm sure you've got some where you are too. But where is the appetite for the hard work in change, right? Because we saw the problems with like revolutions, with like the Arab Spring, where there was a massive uprising, but it didn't take root into sustainable change. And a lot of the sort of analysis post-hoc there was that there wasn't a plan to take over the system. So the same old system just kind of grows back, even if you cut off a few branches. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe you have a more maybe you have some sort of optimistic view on this, because in some sense, this is the optimistic view from where I am in the world, where the threats of violent revolution is like constantly among us. And the idea of a more apathetic generation actually suits the purposes of probably the vast majority of the population.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like something I try to get across in my work is a lot of people advocate for anarchy in my comments. And my stance is, or they'll say like, oh, it's just really bad. Like everything is really bad all the time. And so I tell them that they need to understand the system in order to change it. And I think that's kind of the problem with apathy, is that like there isn't an understanding of the system. People don't really know the interworkings, and so they don't know how to go in and adjust the levers and make like certain parts a little bit better. And so I think that's like one of the problems. And then yeah, I mean it's very easy to come on a podcast and be like, people should do more things, as I'm like not doing a whole lot myself besides talking about it and like just spreading information. And so I'm aware of my own shortcomings there. But I think it's tough. So I've done some work in the politics sphere, and there's an old guard in place. And so if you're trying to like change things from within, there's a lot of resistance to that, because people, it's their life, and you're essentially like, your life needs to change, and maybe you should retire at 70 rather than being president at 80. There's no way you're cognitively functioning completely, and so I think it's tough. And then with the young people being so apathetic, it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, because it's sort of tangential to the vibe session, where it's like, how do you engage people beyond what they think they're capable of? And I'm not sure if it's just like a level of laziness, if like people have given up. I think I try to internally reflect and think like, well, why am I not out there, like, creating an advocacy group for something like this? And it's really just kind of, it is a sense of nihilism, like things are never going to get better, so why try? But of course you have to circumnavigate that. And I don't know. I mean, like there's so many different tentacles to this conversation. Like some people would say that there's not good leaders to like direct people in the right direction. But I don't know why people don't want to do the work to change it. I know some people do. Some people are really doing incredible work in the space, but I would say on whole, I don't know. It's life is like kind of simple, I guess, right? Like things are mostly okay.
It's like, are things not bad enough? That's the other question. Because I mean, like things in the US for young people are objectively, according to like every living standards measure, better for people in South Africa. But still, things are objectively, by like every living standards measure, better for this generation than they were during apartheid, right? So you kind of can look back at your grandparents and parents and still kind of have a sense of progress, or at least enough comfort to not be discomforted enough to want to risk your future through some sorts of literal or figurative kind of violent uprising, which is uncomfortable and comes with a degree of risk. So I wonder if it's more like a risk appetite thing that's a problem. But there's another thing that I wanted to mention to you, which is the kind of awkward elephant in the room that does democracy and capitalism as we know it, which is so kind of entwined in people's ideas about the way the world works, for better or for worse. Does it work with a multi-generational aging society, or does it work only with a growth-orientated, growing, vibrant society where there's more young people than there are old people and dependents? And I asked this from a perspective in that I've just did a look at like what's going on in South Africa compared to the rest of the world. Globally, there's now more over 35s than under 35s. There's more olds than youngs, which means that if you are a young American or a young Chinese person, even if you live in a democratic society, even if your whole generational cohort votes in one direction, the old people just outright outnumber you and outvote you on issues. So on issues like social security and who pays and who gets funded, you literally outvoted. Like your whole generation can vote together and it still won't make a difference, in your actual life, until, as that young gentleman said, they sort of, the old guard dies off and then you become the old people that are now blocking the next group of young people. And so the cycle kind of perpetuates. Whereas in my country, it's a bit different in that just the 18 to 34-year-old cohort, the under 35s voting cohort, if they showed up at the polls, they would make up 49% of the electorate. Like young people down to a very small margin could actually take an election. And since we've got a growing population, within a couple of years, that cohort, by the next election, they'll be over 50%. Young people can make a difference. And yet they're still not showing up to register to vote or to vote at the polls. They still vote at much lower levels than older generations, which I find interesting. But there's still a chance here that democracy works for young people, that young people can see their ideas play out and pay off within their lifespan. Like, I don't think we've had that conversation at the global level, that actually, even if you do the right thing, you show up, you vote, you pay your taxes, you work within the system, maybe you join a political party or start one of your own and you participate, it's still not actually going to make a difference until you are maybe 50 or 60 years old. And that's an awfully long time to wait. And we kind of know this, but we don't talk about it because that's really awkward.
Yeah. No, I think it's very awkward. We're talking about it a little bit more in the US. So I'm 26 for context. So like kind of part of that group that like grew up during COVID and like, was a young adult during COVID. And so has had my career path impacted by that. And I think a lot of people are in a very similar boat. And like, of course, like felt the Great Recession. Like every generation has had a big crisis. But I think the young people have had quite a few. I wrote this piece with Fast Company about like why young people don't want to work anymore. And it's not that they don't want to work, they just work on things that they're passionate about, hypothetically. And so I think in terms of the sort of the battle between the youngs and the olds, as one might say, is that so many policies in the US are designed to benefit old people. The politicians know that their voting base is old people. And so they will design their messaging kind of around that because they know who's going to show up to the polls. We have a housing crisis in the US, and there's so many tax incentives for mortgages. You get to write off a mortgage on your taxes. You don't get to do that as a renter. There's also tax incentives for older people to stay in their homes a very, very long time. Boomers own more four-bedroom houses than millennials do. And millennials are the ones with kids and like probably needing a bigger house. And so like there's all of these issues with stagnancy because of the older generation. The older generation has, it's kind of the opposite of stagnancy, but they've spent so much money. They just have so much money. But there's even sort of a gap in the generation too, like the boomers specifically. I think I mentioned 49% of them don't have retirement savings. The 401k has been a generational experiment. That's the retirement plan in the US. It's entirely based on the stock market. To your question of like, do you have to have growth to maintain sort of the generational
world as we know it?
yeah, exactly. And yeah, you do. You have to have a stock market that goes up a lot, and so that people can retire, which is kind of nuts. And so I think that's kind of part of the issue is that it does require a lot of growth, and it does require companies to invest in people. And I think, it's like 41% of all people have been laid off once in their life, and corporations don't have pension plans for people. There isn't really any sense of loyalty anymore, how maybe there used to be. If you can't get that white picket fence here in the US, like the American dream is to purchase a home, that can create a sense of sadness. And so I think that like things are just not how they were, economically speaking. And it's kind of because of, this is an unpopular take, but I think it's true, is like there's wealth hoarding from the older generation. And rightly so, like kind of, they've been here a long time. You work really hard for your money, you should hold on to it, but they have like trillions and trillions in assets. And there has to be some sort of model where that money gets to the next generation, because right now I think it's a little stuck. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think it's like one of the biggest issues that we face. And it's so awkward to talk about because people are like, what do you mean that you're going to like, tax me more when I have a lot of money? What? It's American individualism is a crisis to a certain extent.
And what are your thoughts on growth then? Let's just get right into that, because growth has become a controversial topic. Of course, we can get into the nuances as to how do we define growth, what is growth, and all the rest of it, and you can come up with slightly different answers. But in general, is the concept of growth something that belongs to older generations, or is it something that is perhaps a birthright for future generations too?
This is, yeah, like you said, it's pretty controversial. Like there's the whole degrowth movement, which I don't agree with. I think that we should kind of encourage growth if we can have it sustainably. But I think the sustainable part is hard. Growth is cost energy. And right, we've been relying heavily on fossil fuels. We've been moving to clean energy, but there's still a cost to that. And I think this is more a philosophical take on it, but I think when growth at any cost becomes the mindset, people get tossed to the side a little bit. So in the US, we like have completely forgotten that a government is kind of meant to serve its people. We don't have a social safety net. We really don't have federal childcare. We don't have pre-K available for kids. We don't have, elder care. Elder care is like 10,000 US dollars a month here. And so like there's all of these parts of the economy that could use something. I don't know if it's like private sector intervention or if that would make things worse, or is it the government coming in to support things? But like you cannot grow hypothetically when all of these threads are starting to fray. Like the fact that people feel like they can't have kids because childcare is too expensive, like that's going to really inhibit growth. And I think like the US has always been a boon for innovation, but right now we're being really weird about immigration, and we're like, you can't come here, anybody ever. And that's wild because the US has been built on the back of immigration since we were founded. And so I think it's like all of these things that we're starting to this is US specific, but like we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I do think growth is important. And I think that the way that it should be is that it always like line always should go up over time. We should always be innovating, and therefore we should always be growing. But I think that we've really created an environment where it's tough to do so. I believe that we can get out the other side of it. I don't think it's going to be permanent. I'm optimistic for the future, but I really think like we've made some terrible decisions over the past 10 years.
And when you say terrible decisions, are you talking about politicians and governments? Or are you talking about us and the things that we paid attention to?
Oh, I mean, I think it's both. I've been really interested in the concept of agency lately. And I think that, Jean Twenge, who wrote iGen, and I think she wrote The Anxious Generation too. I may be making that up, but she wrote the book iGen, and it's around like internal versus external locus of control. And since the 2000s, people have developed a more external locus of control where they blame everything else for their own shortcomings. And I really think a sense of individual responsibility and knowledge that like you're not a victim of circumstance, you're somebody who exists in the world is important. And of course, that's coming from me, who's like, a middle class white person in the US. And so it's easy for me to say that sort of stuff. But I do think there needs to be some sort of knowledge that you can take action and like just put one foot forward and it's okay. But I think that too, like we've had a media environment that has been really toxic in the United States, like Fox News. It has been like 49% of Americans listen to that. And it's fine if you want to listen to it, but you also have to sprinkle in other news sources too. You have to do that even if you listen to CNN, like any sort of news station, you should listen to multiple of them just so you're getting a really well-rounded picture, but people aren't doing that. And so media headlines have become more negative. If you have a negative word in the media headline, the click-through rate increases by 1.9%. Or it increases by 2.3%, a positive word, it decreases by 1.9%. So if you have more negativity, people are going to click more. That's the business model of media. And I think too, like the politicians it reminds me of Roland Barthes and how he wrote about worldwide wrestling and like how politics has become the WWE, this like really flashy show, like politics as theatrics, essentially. And so I think that's kind of what's happened to the US is we have lost a sense of agency. The external locus of control has been on the decline for a long time, or on the external locus of control has been increasing for a long time. The internal locus of control has been decreasing. People are much more likely to blame outside circumstances for their own circumstances than look inward. So agency has been on the decline, but I also think we have a lot of forces at play, such as media headlines, actors instead of politicians, that has made it harder for people to develop a sense of agency.
Yeah, and what is the role that technology plays in that? I think I have slightly controversial opinions on that. Is technology to blame, as like Jonathan Haidt and all of them have said at the moment, for the problems with the children today? Or is perhaps technology patching up some of the real big problems and kind of keeping us alive, where amongst all some of the other issues we've spoken about that really don't have much to do with technology at all when you're talking about sort of aging populations and agency breakdown? Everything's interlinked, as you do know and you do talk about on a daily basis. But what is the role that technology plays in the economy and in the state of children today?
Yeah, I think it's lazy to just blame the phones. Like, I think the phones have something to do with it, but like the decline of third places, the lack of a social safety net, structural affordability, that's not social media. That's
The
like
cause or an effect. I'm with you on that. I think it's
yeah.
more an effect of the problems that we've had that
And I
don't
do
exactly.
think it's, well, I think too, like, and you might share this view that technology has been really important. Like, I think a lot of people have been really lonely and like really sad, and being on social media is super helpful. Like myself included, during the pandemic, it was great to have things like Twitter. Of course, Twitter has its own issues and can perpetuate its own narratives, but I think technology is kind of like what we have to, technology and science specifically, like we've made so many amazing medical breakthroughs over the past few years, but like technology and science is the way forward. And so I don't think we can like point to social media as the reason that people are sad. It's like there's probably something like, come on, looking at pictures on Instagram can make you feel bummed out, but like there's something so much deeper than that. Like there's systemic problems. So that's my take. And obviously, like I'm not a researcher really deep into that space, but that's just my theory.
Well, I think anecdote is just as interesting as all the big data in the world, because there's nothing like playing with big data to make you know just how little it can tell you sometimes.
Yeah.
About what's really going on in people's lives. And my last question, also around technology, because I know you've put out a couple of videos lately because everyone's talking about it and has been for the last year. That's the AI question. Is it gonna kill us all? Is it going to exacerbate inequality, or what's the story here? Or is this or are we like always just more excited about the story than about the actual thing in front of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so I use AI to like ask it questions for my research and to like format certain things, and I find it frustrating to interact with most of the time. But that's just anecdotal. I think the more interesting thing is going to be AI regulation. I think Sam Altman made a giant mistake with the voice mode. So he contacted Scarlett Johansson and was like,
Yeah.
"Can we use your voice?" And she was like, "No," and he did it seemingly anyway. And I think now like the government's going to be all over that, and I think that could be interesting to see like if regulation makes people move faster and like people become more like less risk averse, I guess, and like make bigger decisions even with the regulation. I mean, I think it would make sense. The way that I would love to see it is as a complement to human nature rather than a replacement. But people are like falling in love with them. So, but they've fallen in love with like every iteration of technology, I think. Like people have always found a way to be weird. So I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be something that destroys us all, or if we just kind of use it as a buddy, or if we use it as a research assistant. I know that a lot of companies are really excited about it, which is always kind of a red flag in terms of the actual viability of the product. But I'm not close enough to the space to give a big opinion. But I think over the next year at least, it's going to be AI regulation and what that ends up looking like, just because of what Sam Altman has done with OpenAI.
Yeah, I think in general, my favorite metaphor for that subject, much like most of technology, is that it's a mirror, and mirrors can be quite scary, and they can destroy
Yeah.
us and all the rest of it. Because what is AI? AI is soylent. It's people, right? Like it's
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
regurgitating
That's a
and
great
then
point.
brought back to you, which is
Yeah.
terrible.
No.
Can be self-destructive, but at the same time, if you understand what it is, then these are new tools that we'll learn to cope with. And we have these moral panics around any sort of iteration of technology. Like social media was the moral panic for like the overlapping between our two generations, and AI will be the one going forward. But I think it's really encouraging to see the way my 10-year-old, almost 10-year-old daughter interacts with social media compared to the way, say, I did, because it was new, and her friends have such a more balanced view of it.
Yeah.
Like they play on their gaming platforms that they use as social media platforms, as we all predicted. But they kind of play with it like we used to play with dolls and toys. Like they know it's a toy. They go play with, they like log on to they like phone each other, and they like play together from their different houses. But they're basically playing with dolls, and they're like dressing up their avatars and changing the clothes they wear, and they're like chatting about it. And it's not unhealthy at all. It's kind of cute. I mean, like we used to be a talk on the phone in the 90s, or the people slightly older than us. And then like, we moved the conversation to the mall. But like it's the same sort of patterns play out. And it's, for me, certainly very validating how people that grow up with technologies adapt to them and are not surprised by them or frightened by them, and they are less affected by them from the sort of social aspects and from the fake news aspects and all the rest of it. That like children kind of understand the difference between reality and fiction. That's what children do. Children make up stories and have imaginary best friends, and like these are just like new tools and toys to do that with. I think it's adults that scare me with new technologies, because when we are scared of things, we behave in more scarier ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it can be a different expression of creativity if we let it be. But I do think adults they're just weird with everything. And what do you do about that? And yeah.
We make everything about sex. I mean, like that's just what we do. So
And it's been that way since the beginning of time. Like, the joke about the oldest industry in the world being prostitution.
yeah,
It's true. Yeah.
a leading indicator. Yeah, if it can be exploited in such directions, it surely will.
It will be.
Okay, well
Yeah.
that's a strange and awkward place to leave this conversation. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Hello, great. If you want to close anything off, make any corrections, any last statements, go for it. Otherwise, tell people where and how you like to be found or not, if they want to interact with you or pay you money for something or the other.
Yeah, no, I don't think I have any corrections. I'm sure I should correct something, but I can't remember. The book is available for pre-order, or if this comes out after May 28th, it'll be available on Amazon, on penguinrandomhouse.com. I'll check on the shipping to South Africa thing. I don't know what's going on there, but it's
Just a
available.
copyright thing. So like once it's the same thing with like shows. We can only get them a little bit later. IP
Oh,
law.
well,
I'm sure we'll get it soon.
yeah, there's an ebook, audiobook version. And then I'm across all social media. Most of my stuff is free. Yeah, so
Excellent. Thank you so very much.
thanks for having me.
That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement. And that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations. Conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.